The order to conquer Earth was stamped, sealed, and filed before the first scout ever looked at the planet. That is how the sovereign ledger of the Marek Ascendancy did everything. It did not declare war, it did not threaten, it annexed. A world was surveyed, valued, entered into the great rolls of the ledger, and assigned a conquest column. Once the column existed, the world already belonged to the Ascendancy. The fleet that came afterward was only a formality, the way a clerk stamps a document that has already been decided. The Marek had annexed 11,000 worlds this way, over 9,000 years, and not one of those worlds had ever forced the ledger to change a single number after the stamp went down. Quartermaster Conqueror Sethran Vol had carried out 140 of those annexations himself. He had never lost a ship. He had never been surprised. He sat now on the command tier of the annexation flagship Unbroken Account, a vessel 2 kilometers long built like a filing hall, and he watched the small blue world of Earth grow larger on the forward plate, and he felt the particular boredom of a man doing a thing he had done 100 times before. Behind him, the conquest column was already filling in. The ledger did not wait for results. It recorded the future as if it were the past. Earth, sole inhabited world of an unremarkable yellow star. Population entered. Industry entered. Projected resistance entered as negligible. Projected duration of conquest entered as 4 hours. Projected losses entered as 0. A scribe officer floated beside Sethran's chair and read the columns aloud in the flat ceremonial voice the ledger required, and Sethran half listened, the way a man half listens to a prayer he has heard 10,000 times. He was the reader of this story, and he did not know it yet. He thought he was the writer. There was a thing the Marek believed about themselves, and it was the foundation under every column they had ever stamped. They believed that reality obeyed the record, not that the record described reality, the way a lesser species might keep accounts of what had happened. The Marek believed the record came first. They believed a world entered as conquered became, by the entering, a conquered world, and that the fleet which arrived to make it so was not changing reality, but catching reality up to the rolls. 9,000 years of unbroken success had hardened this belief into something past religion, into the simple texture of how the universe worked. The sun rose because the rolls said it would. A world fell because its column was stamped. To question the column was not heresy, it was madness. The kind of madness that imagines the ground might not be there when you step. No Marek had stepped into open air in 9,000 years, and so no Marek doubted the ground. This was their strength, and it had never once been their weakness, because nothing they conquered had ever understood the belief well enough to use it. The worlds the Marek took fought the fleets. They threw their ships and their fire at the annexation columns, and they lost, every time, because a fleet built to strip a planet's crust is not troubled by a planet's defenses. None of them had ever thought to fight the rolls. None of them had ever grasped that the rolls were the soft place, the unguarded throat, the one door the Marek had left wide open because they could not imagine a thing on the other side of it. The Marek had armored every ship and every world and every fleet, and they had left the ledger itself, the great rolls that decided what was real, sitting open in the dark, defended by nothing but the certainty that no one would ever think to read it back. The annexation fleet around the Unbroken Account numbered 600 ships. That was the standard column for a single world annexation against a species with no significant void presence. 600 ships, 40,000 crew, enough disassembly tonnage to strip a planet's crust and ship it home as ingots and labor. The Marek did not destroy worlds. Destroying a world wasted everything in the column. The Marek processed worlds. They landed, they cataloged, they sorted the living into labor grades, and they began shipping the planet out piece by piece until nothing was left but a number in the rolls and a note that the column was closed. Sethran had read Earth's survey on the crossing. It was a thin file, a young species, a few crude settlements off their own world, none of them armed worth mentioning. A planetary defense capacity the survey rated at 0.3 on the Marek scale, where 1.0 was the minimum needed to inconvenience a single annexation cruiser. The humans had ships, yes. The survey listed 240 of them, scattered across their little system, most of them small, most of them old. The survey had a single line of commentary at the bottom, written by the scout who had done the long-range pass. The line read, "They keep one ship apart from the others. It does nothing. We do not know why." Sethran had read that line twice on the crossing, and then forgotten it. Scouts wrote strange things. A ship that did nothing was a ship that did nothing. He gave the order to drop out of the fold at the system's edge, in full formation, lit and loud, exactly as doctrine required. The Merrick never arrived quietly. Arriving quietly suggested doubt, and the ledger did not permit doubt. 600 ships fell out of the dark in a perfect ordered shell, every running light blazing, every annexation banner unfurled, and they began the slow ceremonial advance toward the blue world, and the scribe officer began to read the surrender terms onto the open channel in 900 languages at once. The terms were always the same. Your world has been entered into the sovereign ledger. Your conquest column is open. Resistance will be recorded as a cost and subtracted from your labor grade. Submit and be sorted. The Ascendancy thanks you for your contribution. The humans did not answer. That was not unusual. Worlds rarely answered the first reading. Sethran had the scribe begin the second reading, and he turned his attention to the 240 human ships the survey had promised, and he found them exactly where the survey said they would be. Spread thin, old, slow, their drives cold or barely warm. None of them moving toward the fleet. They sat in their orbits and their patrol lanes like furniture, and Sethran felt the boredom settle deeper, because this was going to be one of the easy ones, the kind that closed in 3 hours and got him home early. Then the tactical scribe at the third station made a small sound. Not an alarm. The Merrick had no word for alarm in their command tongue, because alarm implied the unexpected, and the ledger did not allow the unexpected. The scribe made the sound a person makes when a number on a page is wrong, and they cannot understand how. Sethran asked what it was. The scribe said the 240 ships were the survey count, but the survey had counted 240 ships that were visible and warm. The scribe had just run a deep passive sweep, the kind done before a landing, and the deep sweep had found something the survey had not. There was a 241st ship. It was the one the scout had written about, the one kept apart. It sat far out beyond the orbit of the system's largest world, in the cold and the dark, alone, where no trade lane ran and no colony grew. It was not lit, it was not warm. Its drive was not cold the way the others were cold, the way a parked ship is cold. The scribe struggled to explain the difference, and finally said it the only way the Merrick had words for. The other ships were asleep. This one was not asleep. This one was still. Sethran asked for the ship's dimensions, expecting another small old hull. The scribe gave him the number, and then gave it to him again, because the first time he said it, Sethran assumed he had misheard. The ship kept apart was 11 kilometers long. Sethran sat forward in his chair for the first time in 140 annexations. 11 kilometers. The unbroken account, the largest ship in his fleet, the flagship of the column, was 2. The Human Survey had rated this world at 0.3. The Human Survey had counted 240 ships, and called the largest of them a patrol cutter. The Human Survey had not mentioned, anywhere, in any line, an 11-kilometer hull sitting alone in the dark on the far side of the system, doing nothing. He told himself the survey had simply missed it. Scouts missed things. The ship was a derelict, an old monument, a hulk the humans had towed out beyond the lanes to die quietly, the way species sometimes did with their oldest ships. 11 kilometers of cold metal was 11 kilometers of salvage, nothing more, and it would be entered into the column under reclaimable tonnage and shipped home like everything else. He had the scribe enter it. Reclaimable derelict, 1 unit, 11 kilometers. The ledger accepted the entry. The column balanced. The boredom tried to return. But the tactical scribe was still making the small wrong number sound, and when Sethran asked him why, the scribe said that the still ship had a name painted along its hull in human script, large enough to read across the system, and the translation banks had rendered it, and the scribe did not understand it, because it did not name a place or a hero or a ledger the way Merrick ships were named. Sethran asked what the name was. The scribe read it out. The still ship was called the Last Reading. And far out in the cold, beyond the orbit of the largest world, on the command deck of a ship that had been kept apart from all the others, and kept ready for 900 years, a single human woman opened her eyes in the dark, and watched 600 lit ships unfurl their banners over her home, and reached out without hurry, and laid one hand flat against the console in front of her, and said, "To no one," in a voice the dark did not carry, the first words anyone aboard had spoken in a very long time. She said, "They finally came." The woman who had spoken was named Captain Mara Quill, and she had been waiting for the Marek longer than most species keep records. She was not old in the way the Marek would have understood old. Her ship had carried her through 900 years, in a sleep that was not quite sleep, a slow cold, keeping that aged a person 1 year for every century, so that her hands were a young woman's hands, and her eyes were something else entirely. She remembered the day the last reading was finished, and towed out beyond the orbit of the gas giant the humans called Halden. She remembered the people who had built it. She remembered why they had built it, and why they had given it the name they gave it, and why they had chosen to keep one captain awake in slow time aboard it, while the rest of the human world slept and grew and forgot. Earth had not forgotten the Marek. Earth had simply never met them. But Earth had met what the Marek left behind. 400 years before Mara Quill was born, a human deep survey ship had crossed an empty system at the galaxy's quiet edge and found a world that had been processed. Not destroyed, processed. The crust shipped out in ingots. The cities sorted and emptied. The population gone. All of it. Every last living thing cataloged into labor grades and carried off, and the only thing left behind was a single stone marker the processors had erected at the planet's pole, and on the marker, in a script the humans took a decade to translate, was a number and a note. The number was the world's entry in the sovereign ledger. The note said the column was closed. The humans had found 4 more such worlds over the next century, each one the same, each one stripped and sorted and closed, and on each one, the same stone marker, the same flat note, the same total absence of anything that had once been alive. The species that had built those cities had names, the humans learned. Names recovered from fragments and archives the processors had not thought worth shipping. The humans learned the names. They learned what those species had looked like, what they had sung, what they had built. They learned all of it from the empty worlds, because the living were gone, and only the dead had been left a marker. And the humans, being human, did a thing the processed worlds had never been given the chance to do. They prepared. They did not know when the ledger would survey Earth. They did not know if it ever would. But they built the last reading against the day, and they gave it a name that meant a promise, and they kept it apart from all their other ships so that no survey would understand what it was, and they kept one captain awake aboard it through the long centuries, so that when the lit ships finally came with their banners and their 900 languages and their flat ceremonial offer to be sorted, there would be someone awake to answer. The building of the ship had taken a single human lifetime, and the understanding behind it had taken 4. The humans had not begun with a weapon. They had begun with a question, and the question was, how a power that had taken 11,000 worlds could be stopped by a species that, on its best day, with its whole industry turned to war, could field perhaps 300 ships. The answer was not more ships. 300 against 600 was a loss. 300 against the war columns the Marek could raise if pressed was an erasure. The humans had run the numbers 1,000 ways across 400 years, and every way the numbers came out the same, which was that you do not beat a power that decides the outcome before the battle, by fighting the battle. You beat it by reaching the place where it decides. It was an engineer named Hale Orsk who first understood what the Marek markers actually were. He had spent 30 years on the closed worlds, cataloging the stone, translating the notes, and somewhere in the 3rd decade, he stopped reading the markers as gravestones and started reading them as receipts. The Marek were not recording deaths. They were recording transactions, balanced columns. And a balanced column was a closed loop, and a closed loop, Orsk argued in a paper that the human worlds debated for 40 years, must by its nature connect back to the thing that kept the books. The markers were not the end of a thread. They were the visible knot of a thread that ran, unbroken, all the way back to the sovereign ledger itself, and a thread that ran inward could be followed inward, and a thing followed inward could be reached. The Marek had stamped a receipt on every world they closed, and on the back of every receipt, invisible to them, because they had never imagined anyone would read it back, was the address of the open door. The last reading was the answer to Hale Orsk's paper. It was not a gun, and it was not a fortress. It was a reader, the largest and most patient reader ever built. 11 kilometers of instrument, whose entire purpose was to follow the thread the markers left, and reach the rolls, and, once inside, to do nothing more complicated than read what was already written there, in the order it was written, and to keep reading until the writing stopped. The humans had built it slowly and quietly, and they had towed it out beyond the orbit of the gas giant Halden, where no survey would think to look closely, and they had kept it dark, because a thing that is going to read a ledger back must above all not look like a weapon, must look like exactly what the Merrick scout would later write down, a ship kept apart that does nothing, for a reason no one understands. Mara Quill had read every recovered name. She had read them so many times in the slow dark that she knew them the way she knew her own. The names of the species the ledger had closed. She kept them in a file aboard the last reading, the only file the ship carried, and she had read it once a year for 900 years, on the anniversary of the day the ship was towed out, which was why the ship was called what it was called. Every year she performed the last reading of the closed worlds, the reading the ledger had denied them, the saying aloud of every name that had been entered and stripped and forgotten. She had read it 900 times. She had always known there would be a final time, a reading after which the file would not need to be read again, because the thing that had written all those columns would no longer exist to write more. She watched the 600 ships unfurl their banners over Earth, and she understood that this was the year of the last reading, and she felt something that was not fear, and was not joy. It was the quiet a person feels when a thing they have prepared for across an entire life finally arrives, and is exactly the size they always knew it would be. She did not move the ship. She did not light the drive. She let the Merrick do what the Merrick always did, which was talk. On the command tier of the unbroken account, Sethran Vole had decided the 11-kilometer derelict was a derelict. He had decided it because the alternative was that the survey had been catastrophically wrong, and the ledger did not produce catastrophically wrong surveys, and a quartermaster conqueror who suggested otherwise on the record was suggesting the ledger could err. So the still ship was a derelict, and Sethran ordered the annexation to proceed on schedule, and the fleet began its ceremonial advance toward Earth to begin the landings. He had the scribe read the surrender terms a third time. Still the humans did not answer. He noted the non-response in the column as resistance of grade 1, the lowest grade. The grade given to worlds too primitive to understand they were being conquered. He felt the boredom return at last, because a grade 1 world was the easiest kind, a world that did not even know enough to be afraid. It was the tactical scribe again, who would not let the boredom hold. The scribe reported that the 11-kilometer derelict had changed. Not moved, changed. Its hull, which had been cold and dark and still, had developed a single point of light. One light, far out in the dark, where a moment before there had been none. The scribe could not say what the light was. It was not a drive flare. It was not a weapon charge that any Merrick instrument recognized. It was simply a light, small and steady and white, appearing on the hull of a ship that the column had entered as a dead thing. Sethran told the scribe that derelicts did not produce lights. The scribe agreed that they did not. And then the open channel, the channel the Merrick had been broadcasting their surrender terms on for the better part of an hour, the channel no human ship had answered in 3 full readings, made a sound. A voice came across it. A single human voice, calm and unhurried, speaking in the Merrick command tongue, perfectly, with no accent the translation banks could find, as if the speaker had known the Merrick language for a very long time, and had simply been waiting for a reason to use it. The voice said, "This is the last reading. I have your terms. I would like to read you something in return." Sethran sat very still in his chair. A grade 1 world did not speak the Merrick command tongue. A grade 1 world did not have a ship that learned the Conqueror's language and waited 900 years to use it. He told himself, again, that there was an explanation, that the survey would account for it, that the column would balance. He told the scribe to open the channel for reply, and he spoke into it himself, which a quartermaster conqueror almost never did, because the terms were read by scribes, and the conquered did not merit the voice of the conqueror. He said, "Derelict, identify your authority. You are addressing the annexation column of the sovereign ledger. Your world is entered, and your column is open. Resistance is recorded as cost." The voice answered without any change in its calm. It said, I know what you are. I have known what you are for 900 years. I have read your markers. I have stood on the worlds you closed. I have the names. Sethrin did not understand. He asked what names, and the voice on the channel began to read. It read names, not human names. Names in languages the translation banks strained to render, old names. Names that did not appear in any current entry of the ledger, because their columns had been closed, and closed columns were archived, and archived columns were not spoken. The voice read the name of a species the Marek had processed 1100 years before Sethrin was born, a species whose homeworld was now a quarry with a stone marker at its pole. The voice read the name of the world. The voice read the name of the species' last leader, recovered from a fragment the processors had not bothered to ship. The voice read, and did not stop, and on the command tier of the unbroken account, a strange cold began to spread, because every Marek aboard knew that those names were real. They were archive real. They were columns the ledger had closed and sealed and never expected to hear spoken aloud by anything still alive. Sethrin ordered the channel cut. The scribe cut it. The voice came through anyway. It was not coming through the channel anymore. It was coming through every system aboard the unbroken account that could produce a sound, the way water comes through a hull that has been opened, and the Marek had no defense against it, because the Marek had never built a defense against being spoken to, because nothing they conquered had ever spoken back. The voice read names for 4 minutes. 4 minutes does not sound long. Sethrin would later think it was the longest 4 minutes of his life, longer than any battle, because in 4 minutes, the voice read the names of 9 closed worlds, and every name was a column the ledger swore did not need to exist anymore. And with every name, the cold on the command tier grew, because the Marek were beginning to understand a thing they had no word for. They were beginning to understand that they had been found out, that somewhere in the dark, across all the centuries of stamping columns and closing worlds, a witness had survived, not a survivor of any world they had closed. A witness who had read the markers and kept the names and waited. There was a young scribe at the 4th station who had never been off the seat of the ledger before this crossing. He was on his first column. He had spent his whole training learning the roles, learning to read the columns aloud in the flat ceremonial voice, learning that the entry came first and reality followed, and he believed it the way he believed in the floor. As the human voice read the names, this young scribe did a thing he was not supposed to do, which was check them. He pulled the deep archive on his own station, and he searched for the names the voice was speaking, and he found them, one after another, exactly as the voice said them: closed columns, sealed worlds, stone markers, and the matching was the worst thing that had ever happened to him, because a name the voice could not have known unless it had stood at the marker was a name that proved the voice had stood at the marker, and a thing that had stood at the markers of the worlds the Marek closed was a thing that had been following the Marek across the dark for longer than the young scribe had been alive, watching, reading, keeping. He stopped checking after the 6th name, and he did not want to know how many more would match. When the voice finished reading, it was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "That is the reading. There are more names. There are 11,000 columns in your ledger, and I do not have them all. But I have these, and I am going to make sure you never close another one." Sethrin found his voice. He was a quartermaster conqueror of the Marek Ascendancy, commander of a 600-ship column, and he had just been threatened by a single derelict with one light on its hull, and the absurdity of it steadied him. He said, "You are one ship, you have not moved, you have not lit your drive, you are 11 kilometers of old metal reading a list. I have 600 ships, I have 40,000 crew, I have the sovereign ledger, you have a name and a grievance. Light your drive, or do not. The landings begin in 1 hour. Your world's column is open, and it will be closed on schedule." The voice did not argue. That was the thing Sethrin would remember most, afterward, in the time he had left to remember things. The voice did not argue. It did not threaten again. It simply said, in the same calm it had used the whole time, "You have 1 hour. I am giving it to you because I want you to spend it the way the worlds you closed never got to. I want you to look at your column and know it is wrong." Then it said, "The drive does not need to be lit. You misunderstand what kind of ship this is." And the channel closed, this time from the human side, and the single white light on the hull of the last reading went out, and the 11-kilometer ship in the dark went still again, as still as it had been for 900 years. Sethran sat on the command tier and did not give an order for a full minute, which for him was an eternity. The scribes waited. The column waited. Earth turned slowly below, blue and small and silent, its 240 old ships still cold in their lanes, still doing nothing, and Sethran understood now that they were not the threat, and had never been the threat. They were furniture. They were the survey the humans had wanted the Merrick to see. The real ship had always been the one kept apart, the one the scout had written one strange line about, the one that did nothing, and Sethran had read that line on the crossing and forgotten it, and the forgetting was going to cost him in a way the column did not have room to record. He almost ordered the fleet to fire on the derelict. He almost did. His hand was on the order. 600 ships, every one of them armed to strip a planet's crust, against one cold hull. It would have taken seconds. The column would have entered it as reclaimable tonnage destroyed in place, a small loss, a rounding error. He did not give the order. He told himself it was because the derelict had not moved, had not fired, had given him an hour, and the ledger rewarded patience over waste. That was what he told himself. The truth he would only admit much later, was that he did not give the order, because the voice had read those names, and the names were real, and somewhere underneath 9,000 years of certainty, a single very old fear had woken up in the Merrick and asked a question the ledger had never permitted. The question was, what if the column is wrong? He pushed the question down. He ordered the landings to proceed on the hour, as scheduled. He ordered the fleet to ignore the derelict. He ordered the scribe to enter the human ship's broadcast as resistance of grade 2, hostile non-compliance, and to note that the resisting unit had not engaged and posed no measured threat. The ledger accepted the entry. The column balanced. The boredom did not return, but a kind of false calm took its place. The calm of a man who has decided not to look at the thing in the corner of the room, because looking at it would mean it was there. He should have used the hour to flee. He understood that later, with a clarity that never stopped hurting. He had been given an hour by a thing that did not need to give him anything, and the only honest reason to give a doomed man an hour is to let him run. And a wiser commander, a commander who had ever once lost, might have heard the mercy under the words, and turned the column around, and folded for the edge of the system, as fast as 600 ships could go. But Sethran Vol had never lost, and a man who has never lost cannot hear a warning as a warning. He heard it as a bluff. He heard a single cold ship that had not moved or fired in an hour of being threatened, and he heard a list of old names read by a voice that wanted him afraid, and he concluded, the way 9,000 years of unbroken success had trained him to conclude, that a thing which only talks is a thing which cannot do, and that the reading was a grievance, dressed as a threat by the last witness of worlds too weak to be avenged. He spent the hour the way the human voice had told him to spend it, though not in the way she meant. He looked at his column. He looked at the conquest column for Earth, projected duration 4 hours, projected losses 0, and he found it orderly and balanced, and exactly as it had always been, and instead of seeing what was wrong with it, he saw only that it was the same as the 140 columns before it, and he took comfort in the sameness. The sameness was the trap. The last reading had told him to look at his column and know it was wrong, and he had looked at his column and known it was right. Because a man cannot see the error in a thing he has never once seen err, and that blindness, more than any weapon, was the thing the humans had spent 400 years learning to use. The hour began to count down. Out in the dark, aboard the last reading, Mara Quill closed the file of names. She had read 9 of them. She had wanted to read all of them, every name in the file, but the file held the dead of 40 closed worlds, and there was not time for 40. And she had chosen the 9 that mattered most to her, the 9 she had read first on every anniversary, the 9 she had promised herself she would read to the thing that closed them before she did what she had been built to do. She had not lied to Sethran. The drive did not need to be lit. He had misunderstood what kind of ship the last reading was, the way the survey had misunderstood, the way 9,000 years of conquered worlds had misunderstood, right up until the markers went down. The last reading was not a ship built to fight a fleet. A ship built to fight a fleet was the human survey's 240 cutters, old and slow, and exactly as harmless as they looked. The last reading was a ship built to do one thing, to one ledger, one time, and it did not need to move to do it. And it did not need to fire in the way the Merrick understood firing, and it had been kept apart and kept ready for 900 years, justly so that when the lit ships came with their banners, there would be one weapon in the dark that the survey could not see, the column could not enter, and the ledger could not close. Mara Quill set the hour Sethran had given her on the ship's old clock. She did not intend to use the whole hour. She had given him the hour for the same reason she had read the names. She wanted the thing that closed worlds to spend its last clean hour believing it was still the writer of the story, so that the moment it learned otherwise would land with the full weight of 9,000 years behind it. She watched the 600 lit ships begin to lower toward Earth, banners unfurled, landing tonnage warming, the great processing column descending on her home the way it had descended on 40 homes before, certain, ordered, bored. She let them come a little closer. She wanted them inside the line she had drawn. Then she laid her hand flat on the console again, the way she had at the very beginning, and she said the second thing anyone aboard had said in 900 years. She said, "The reading is finished." And she did the thing the last reading had been built to do. It did not begin with a flash. The Merrick had braced, without admitting they were bracing, for a flash, for a weapon, for a beam, or a barrage, or some last desperate firing from the derelict that they would absorb and record and subtract. That was what conquered things did when they finally understood. They threw their last fire, and it was never enough, and the column entered it as cost. The last reading did not throw fire. The last reading did something the Merrick had no instrument to read, and no word to name, and it did it everywhere at once. On the command tier of the unbroken account, every system that produced light dimmed by exactly 1 degree, as if the ship had taken a single breath inward. The scribes felt it more than saw it. The tactical scribe, the one who had been making the small wrong number sound since the deep sweep, opened his mouth to report, and found he had nothing to report, because nothing on his board had changed. No weapon had fired, no drive had lit. The derelict, 11 kilometers out in the dark, sat exactly where it had sat for 900 years, cold and dark and still. And then the 600 ships of the annexation column began to stop existing, and they did it in the order they had been entered into the ledger. The first to go was the lead landing tender, a small ship near the front of the descent, and it did not explode. It simply was not there anymore. One instant, it was a ship descending toward Earth with a crew of 60 and a banner unfurled, and the next instant, there was a space where the ship had been, and the space was clean, no debris, no flare, no wreckage tumbling, nothing, as if the ship had been a word erased from a page, and the page smoothed flat behind it. The scribe whose station tracked the tender watched its entry in the column, and the entry did not change to destroyed, because destroyed was a status the ledger recorded, for a thing that had been and was no longer. The entry changed to something the ledger had no category for. The entry simply emptied. The tender's column became a blank, as if the ship had never been entered at all, as if it had never been built, as if no one had ever stood on its deck. Then the second ship emptied, then the third, then the fourth. The last reading was reading the column. Sethran understood it before any of his scribes did, because Sethran was the one who had entered the ships, and he was watching the rolls, and he saw the entries going blank one after another in the exact order he had stamped them, and he understood with a horror that had no Merrick word that the human ship had not destroyed his fleet. It had unwritten it. It had reached into the sovereign ledger itself, the great rolls that recorded a world as conquered before the fleet arrived, the same rolls that had closed 40 worlds and stamped them empty, and it was running the column backward, and every ship whose entry went blank ceased, in the same instant, to be a ship. A scribe at the second station tried to fire. He was not a soldier, he was a clerk, but he had a clerk's instinct for correcting an error, and the entries emptying in front of him read to him as an error in the rolls, and the way a Merrick corrected an error was to act on it. He gave the order for the nearest annexation cruiser to bring its disassembly array to bear on the 11-kilometer hull. The order went out. The cruiser's entry went blank before the order finished transmitting, and the scribe sat looking at the place where a cruiser and its 300 crew had been, and at the order he had just given a ship that the rolls now said had never existed, and something in him that had been certain for his whole life came quietly apart, because he had just commanded a thing that was never built to fire on a thing that could not be fought. And both of those impossibilities had happened in the same half-beat, and there was no column for either. The Merrick had built their entire civilization on a single idea, that the entry came first and the reality followed, that a world entered as conquered was conquered, that a column once stamped was already true. It was their strength. It was how they had taken 11,000 worlds without ever once losing a war, because they had decided the outcome before the battle, and then made the universe agree. The humans had understood that idea better than the Merrick themselves. The humans had stood on the closed worlds and read the markers and grasped the one thing the Merrick had never grasped, which was that a thing which records reality as true can be made to record reality as false, and that a ledger powerful enough to make a stamp into a conquest is a ledger powerful enough, in the right hands, to make a stamp into an erasure. The last reading was not a gun, it was a pen. It was 11 kilometers of the most patient weapon any species had ever built. A weapon that did not fight the ledger but used it, that did not break into the rolls but was invited in by the very act of being entered as reclaimable tonnage. 1 unit, 11 kilometers. And from inside the rolls it had begun, calmly and in order, to close the column on the column keepers. It took 6 seconds. The Merrick measured time in beats, and the whole of it, from the first emptied tender to the last, took fewer beats than a scribe needed to read a single line of terms. 600 ships, 40,000 crew, the disassembly tonnage, the landing column, the banners, the 900 languages, the perfect ordered shell that had fallen out of the dark lit and loud. All of it went blank in the rolls, in order, one entry after another, faster than any voice could have named them, and as each entry went blank, the ship it described stopped being, cleanly. No flash, no debris, no scream. The way a closed world stops being a world and becomes a number and a marker and a note. The crews did not suffer. That was Mara Quill's single mercy, and she had built it into the ship deliberately, and she thought about it in the 6 seconds the way a person thinks a clear thought in a long-rehearsed moment. The worlds the Merrick closed had suffered. They had been sorted and graded and shipped out alive, broken into labor, worked until the column balanced. Mara Quill could have done that. The last reading could have done that. Could have run the column backwards slowly, ship by ship, a beat apart, and let the Merrick watch their fleet vanish entry by entry, with full understanding of what was happening to them. She had considered it across 900 years. She had decided against it. Not because the Merrick deserved mercy, because the species who had built the last reading had decided, in their long preparation, that they would not become the thing that closed worlds, that they would end the ledger without becoming a second ledger, that the difference between a witness and a conqueror was that a witness did not make the dying last. So the crews did not suffer, they simply were not, and then they had never been, as far as the roles were concerned, and the only ones left to know they had ever existed were the humans who had kept the names, which was the point, which had always been the point. Mara Quill felt every entry as she read it. The ship was built so that she would. She could have run the reading blind, let the instrument do its work while she looked away, and across 900 years she had wondered whether she would, when the day came, whether she would have the stomach to watch 600 crews go blank one after another, even knowing what those crews had come to do to her home. She had decided, somewhere in the 3rd century of waiting, that she would watch. Not because watching was just, because the worlds the Merrick closed had not been allowed to look away from their own ending, and she would not grant herself a mercy she could not grant them, and a witness who looks away is not a witness, only a weapon with a conscience it refuses to use. So she watched. She read the column of the fleet sent to close her world, and she felt each ship leave the rolls, the way you feel a held breath finally let go, and she did not look away, and she did not enjoy it, and she did not stop. It would have been easy to enjoy it. That was the thing she had been most afraid of. Across the long dark, she had read the names of 40 closed worlds 900 times. She had stood at the markers. She had every reason in the galaxy to want the Merrick to suffer, and the last reading was a weapon that could have made them suffer in any way she chose. Slowly, with full understanding, the conquerors made it last to feel what they had spent 9,000 years inflicting. She had imagined it. No one who keeps the names of the murdered for 9 centuries does not imagine it. And she had built the ship, deliberately, so that it could not do it, so that the only thing the last reading could do was read a column blank cleanly and quickly, and without pain, because she did not trust the version of herself that would arrive at the end of 900 years. And she had wanted to make the merciful choice once, in the design, while she was still someone who could make it, so that the version of her who finally faced the Merrick would not be given the chance to become them. 600 ships, 6 seconds. The Merrick had no precedent for it, because there had never been a precedent for anything happening to the Merrick at all. In 9,000 years, their worst day had been a column that took longer than projected to close, an annexation that ran 6 hours instead of 4, because a world fought harder than its survey suggested. They had a word for a costly conquest. They had no word for a conquest that had reached the human system in full order, lit and loud, 600 strong, and ceased to have ever existed in less time than it takes to read a single line of terms aloud. The thing had no shape in their language. It would not have a shape for a long time, and when it finally did, the word they coined for it would not mean defeat, because defeat is a thing that happens to a fleet that fought and lost. The word they coined would mean the reading, and it would be the most feared word in the Merrick tongue, and it would be a human word, kept. Sethran Vol survived the 6 seconds. He survived because the last reading had entered the unbroken account into the column last, deliberately, in the order Sethran himself had stamped, and because Mara Quill stopped the reading 1 entry short. 599 ships emptied from the rolls. The flagship did not. Sethran sat on the command tier of the only ship left from a 600-ship column, in a silence so total it had a weight, surrounded by stations whose scribes had not been on the emptied ships, and so were still alive, still breathing, still staring at boards that showed a fleet that no longer existed, and had, the rolls now insisted, never been built. The open channel made a sound again, the same calm human voice. It said, "I left you for last, because you stamped yourself last. That is how the column works. You taught me," it said. "Your fleet is not destroyed. Destroyed would mean it was. I have done to your fleet what your fleet did to 40 worlds. I have closed its column. As far as the sovereign ledger is now concerned, the annexation column for Earth was never opened, the fleet was never built, and the conquest never began. You will find, if you check your rolls, that the entries are gone, not changed, gone, the way the worlds you closed are gone." Sethran checked his rolls. The voice was right. The conquest column for Earth was not marked failed, was not marked withdrawn, was not marked destroyed. It was blank. It read as if no survey had ever been done, as if no fleet had ever been assigned, as if Earth had never been entered at all. 11,000 columns remained in the sovereign ledger of the Merrick Ascendancy. The column for Earth was not among them. It had never been. The ledger itself, the unquestionable rolls, the thing the Merrick had built their 9,000 years upon, now agreed with the humans that the Merrick had never come. The voice said, "You have one ship and a crew that was not on the others. You are going to fly that ship home. You are going to carry the rolls back to your ascendancy, and you are going to let them read what the rolls now say. You are going to be the marker. Every world you closed got a marker. Now your ledger gets one, and the marker is you, and the note on the marker is that there is a witness in the dark who has the names, and who can reach the rolls, and who will be reading the rest of your columns one at a time, in order, until there are none left to close." Sethran did not answer. There was nothing in the Marek command tongue to answer with. He sat in the silence of his impossible survival and looked at the blue world that the rolls now swore his fleet had never reached, and he understood, fully and finally, the thing the voice had given him an hour to understand. The column had been wrong. The column had always been able to be wrong. The Merrick had spent 9,000 years believing the entry made the reality, and a single ship kept apart in the dark by a species they had rated at 0.3 had just proven that the entry made the reality both ways, and that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a fleet, but a witness who understands your own weapon better than you do. The voice said one more thing before it went quiet. It said, "My name is Mara Quill. I was awake for 900 years so that someone would be here when you came. I have read you the names of 9 of the worlds you closed. There are 31 more in my file, and 11,000 in your rolls, and I have time. Tell your ascendancy that the reading has begun." Then it said, "You may go now. The hour is over." and the single white light reappeared on the hull of the last Reading, far out in the dark, steady and small, and patient. And then it went out, and the 11-kilometer ship went still as it had been before, waiting for the next column, however long the wait would be. Sethran Vol flew home alone, and the journey took him 40 days, and he spent every one of them reading the rolls. He could not stop reading them. He told himself he was checking for an error, that somewhere in the great archive of the Sovereign Ledger there would be a line that proved the human ship had only hidden the entries, only suppressed them, that the fleet still existed somewhere in the rolls and would reappear if he searched long enough. He searched. The fleet was not there. Not hidden, not archived, not flagged. Gone. 599 ships, and the 40,000 who had crewed them were not anywhere in the rolls of the Ascendancy, and a Merrick who was not in the rolls had not existed, because the rolls were the Merrick measure of existence, and that was the horror Sethran carried home, that no weapon could have inflicted. His crew were not dead. The dead were in the rolls. The dead had columns. His crew were unwritten, and there is no grief in the Marek tongue for the unwritten, because the Marek had never imagined a thing could happen to them that they had spent 9,000 years doing to everyone else. He arrived at the heart of the Ascendancy, the great administrative world the Marek called the seat of the ledger, and he carried the rolls to the high scribes, and he told them what had happened, and they did not believe him. They did not believe him because the rolls did not support him. The rolls said no fleet had ever been sent to Earth. The rolls said no column for Earth had ever been opened. As far as the unquestionable archive of the Marek Ascendancy was concerned, Sethran Vol had taken his flagship out alone on a survey crossing, found nothing of interest, and come home, and the 599 ships he insisted had been annihilated had never existed to be annihilated. The high scribes checked the construction rolls. The ships were not there. They checked the crew rolls. The crews were not there. They checked the assignment rolls, the supply rolls, the banner rolls, every archive in which a 600-ship column would have to appear, and the column was nowhere, and a quartermaster conqueror standing before them, insisting on the existence of 40,000 people the rolls had never recorded, was, by every Marek measure, a man who had lost his reason. They were going to have him quietly removed. A quartermaster conqueror who could not be trusted to read the rolls correctly was a danger to the column. Sethran saw it in their faces, the faces of scribes who had decided he was broken, and he understood that the human ship had done something even crueler than erasing his fleet. It had erased his fleet in a way that made him a liar in the eyes of his own people, because the only proof his crew had ever lived was his memory, and the Marek did not trust memory. The Marek trusted the rolls, and the rolls now agreed with Mara Quill. It was the high scribe of the deepest archive who stopped them. She was very old, older than any scribe at the seat, and she had spent her life in the closed columns, the archived worlds, the part of the ledger no living Marek had reason to read. And when she heard Sethran say the human ship had read him names from the closed columns, she went to the deepest archive herself, and she pulled the 9 columns Sethran named, and she found that they had been touched. Not erased. The closed columns of the 40 worlds the Marek had processed were all still there, all 11,000 of them, every quarry world and stripped crust and stone marker. But the 9 columns Sethran named, the 9 the human voice had read aloud, had a note appended to each, a note that no Marek scribe had written, a note in the human script the translation banks had only recently learned to render, and the note on each of the 9 closed columns said the same thing. It said, "Read aloud, in the dark, by a witness who kept the name." It said, "This column is no longer sealed." It said, "The reading has begun." The old high scribe carried the 9 columns to the others, and she made them read the notes, and the seat of the ledger went very quiet, because now there was proof in the rolls, and the proof did not say Sethran was mad. The proof said something far worse. The proof said that a thing existed which could reach into the sovereign ledger from outside, append to the sealed columns, empty the active ones, and leave a note in a script the Marek had not authorized. The proof said the rolls were not unquestionable. The proof said the one thing 9,000 years of Marek civilization had been built to deny, which was that there was a hand the column could not record, working in the dark, and it had the names, and it was reading. There were Marek at the seat, who refused to accept even the proof, This is the way of any power that has been certain too long. A faction of the high scribes argued that the notes were a forgery, that some clever species had learned to tamper with the deep archive, that the human ship was a trick, and Sethran's missing fleet a deception, and that the proper response was to do nothing, to record the anomaly, to seal it deeper, and to wait for the rolls to right themselves the way the rolls always righted themselves. They were not stupid, these scribes. They were faithful. They had given their whole lives to the belief that the column came first and reality followed. And a being who has spent 90 years inside that belief does not abandon it because 9 entries grew a note. They would rather believe the universe had been tampered with than believe the ledger could be wrong, because if the ledger could be wrong, then nothing the Merrick had ever done was certain, and 9,000 years of closed worlds became, retroactively, not the orderly accounting of a perfect civilization, but the crimes of a people who had simply been the strongest, and no Merrick could survive thinking that, so they did not think it. The old high scribe let them argue for 9 days. Then she did the cruelest thing a Merrick could do to another Merrick. She read them the column for the war column they were proposing to build, before they had built it, the way the ledger always recorded the future as the past, and she pointed out that the projected losses column, the one that for 9,000 years had read 0, had this time refused her stamp. She tried to enter the war column's projected losses as 0, the way every column had always been entered, and the rolls would not take the entry. For the first time in the history of the Merrick ascendancy, the sovereign ledger declined to record a conquest as already won. The projected losses field for the war column simply would not fill. It sat blank, not 0, blank, the same blank the emptied ships had left, as if the ledger itself had read the future, and seen the reading coming, and refused, for the first time, to lie. That ended the argument. A faithful Merrick could doubt a note in a script he could not read. He could not doubt the rolls themselves declining to balance, because the rolls were the one thing he could not call a forgery, and when the rolls refused to promise a victory, every scribe at the seat understood, in the marrow of his long certainty, that the thing in the dark was real, and had the names, and could not be lied about even by the ledger that had lied about everything for 9,000 years. The ascendancy did the thing every certain power does when its certainty is broken. It decided to destroy the proof. The high command of the Merrick met, and they reasoned that the human ship was a single hull, 11 kilometers, undeniably powerful, but undeniably one, and that whatever it had done to the column at Earth it had done by surprise, and that a thing done by surprise could be prevented by overwhelming and immediate force. They reasoned that Sethran's column had been a standard annexation column, 600 ships, designed for a world rated at 0.3, and that such a column was never meant to face a weapon of this kind. They reasoned that what was needed was not an annexation column but a war column, the kind the Merrick had not assembled in 2,000 years because no world had ever required one. A column built not to process but to obliterate, to strike the human ship before it could read a single entry, to end the witness and reseal the columns and restore the rolls to their proper silence. They assembled the war column. It took them 90 days. It numbered 9,000 ships. 9,000 ships, the largest force the Merrick ascendancy had fielded since the founding wars. Every one of them built or refitted for a single purpose, to deliver so much fire in the first instant that no weapon, however patient, would have the seconds it needed to act. They had studied Sethran's account. They had grasped that the human ship needed a small span of time, 6 beats, to run its terrible reading, and they had built the war column to deny it those beats, to arrive already firing, to fill the dark around the 11-kilometer hull with so much immediate destruction that the ship would be unwritten before it could unwrite anything. The mistake in this reasoning was a single word, and the word was time. The Merrick had decided the human ship's weapon was a thing that needed seconds, and they had built a fleet to deny it seconds, and in doing so, they had revealed that they still did not understand what had happened at Earth. They thought they had been beaten by speed, by a weapon that fired faster than they could react, and the answer to a fast weapon is to fire first. But the last reading had not beaten them with speed. The 6 seconds at Earth had not been the weapon working. The 6 seconds had been Mara Quill choosing to take 6 seconds, reading slowly, in order, on purpose, when she could have emptied the column in a single instant if she had wished. The weapon did not need time at all. The weapon needed only that the ships be entered, and the Merrick, in their certainty, were about to enter 9,000 of them and call it a defense. There were a handful at the seat who saw this. The old high scribe was one. She stood before the high command and tried to say it plainly, that a fleet which fires first cannot beat a weapon that does not care when you fire, that the only force which could possibly trouble the witness was no force at all, that the correct response to the last reading was to leave Earth alone forever and pray the reading stopped at the fleets it had already taken. They did not listen. A power that has decided to destroy the proof of its own fallibility cannot be told that the destroying is impossible, because to accept that is to accept the fallibility, and the whole point of the war column was to avoid accepting it. So they built the fleet that could not work, and they told themselves it was the largest fleet in their history, and therefore could not fail, and the largeness was exactly the thing that would damn it, because every ship in it was one more entry the human woman would not even have to chase. They gave the war column to the highest commander of the ascendancy, the first conqueror, a being who had never in 400 years failed to close a column. They entered the war column into the rolls, 9,000 ships, the largest entry the ledger had ever recorded. And then, because the old high scribe insisted, because she had read the note on the 9 columns and understood something the others would not, they sent Sethran Vol with the war column too. They did not send him as a commander, they sent him as a reader. The old high scribe argued, against the contempt of the high command, that the human ship had communicated with Sethran, had given him a message, had named itself to him, and that whatever was about to happen, the ascendancy needed someone aboard who had heard the witness speak, and might understand what it said next. They put Sethran on a ship near the rear of the war column, a small ship, far from the first conqueror's flagship, and they told him to listen and record, and Sethran went, because he had nothing left. His crew were unwritten. His word was broken. The only people in the galaxy who knew his 599 ships had ever existed were the humans who had erased them, and some part of Sethran, a part he did not examine, wanted to be there when the war column reached the dark, not because he believed it would win, but because he no longer believed the rolls, and the only voice left that had told him the truth was the calm human voice that had read him the names. The war column crossed to the human system in a single enormous fold, 9,000 ships arriving at once, lit and loud the way the Merrick always arrived, but faster, harder, already charging their fire as they fell out of the dark, the first conqueror's flagship at the center, the order to obliterate the 11-kilometer hull already given, already counting down, every gun in 9,000 ships sighting on the single point in the dark, where the last reading had sat still for 900 years. The last reading was not there. The point in the dark where the human ship had waited, the point beyond the orbit of the gas giant Halden, where Sethran's deep sweep had found one still cold hull, was empty. The war column fell out of the fold, sighting on nothing, 9,000 ships charged and counting down on a patch of empty space, and the first conqueror demanded the ship's location, and the scribes searched, and the scribes found it, and the finding was the last clear order the first conqueror would ever give. The last reading was not in the dark beyond Halden anymore. It was at the center of the war column. It had been entered into the rolls. The Merrick had entered 9,000 ships into the war column, the largest entry the ledger had ever recorded, and the human ship, which understood the ledger better than the Merrick who kept it, had let itself be entered too, a 9,001st line in a column built to destroy it, and an entry in the column was a position in the column, and the last reading had simply taken the position its entry described, which was the center, beside the first conqueror's flagship, inside the war column's own formation, where not one of the 9,000 ships could fire on it without firing on each other, and where it sat now, cold and dark and 11 kilometers long, in the heart of the largest fleet the Merrick had ever built, having arrived there not by flying, but by being written. The open channel made a sound, the same calm voice. It said, "You built a fleet to deny me 6 seconds. It said, I do not need 6 seconds when you bring me to the center yourselves. It said, I have read your war column. There are 9,000 entries. I am going to read them now." And from a small ship near the rear, Sethran Vol, the only Marek alive who had heard this voice before, who had carried its message home and been called mad for it, closed his eyes and did not warn anyone, and waited for the reading to begin. The reading of the war column took 11 seconds, which was the longest the last reading had ever taken. Because there were 9,000 entries, and Mara Quill read every one of them in order, and she did not hurry, because she had decided long ago that the only time she would ever hurry was never. It began the way it had begun at Earth, with no flash. The 9,000 ships of the war column hung in their perfect ordered shell around their own center, all their guns charged, all their fire sighted outward at a hull that was no longer outside them but inside them, and not one gun could fire without striking the ships beside it. And in the half-instant, the first conqueror needed to comprehend this and order the formation to break. The reading began. The first entry to empty was a ship near the front of the war column, and it did not explode. It simply was not there anymore. And the space it left was clean, and its entry in the rolls went blank, not destroyed, not lost, blank, as if the ship had never been built, as if no one had ever stood on its deck. Then the second entry emptied, then the third, and the Merrick, who had built this entire war column on the single lesson of Sethran's account, who had armored themselves against 6 seconds of vulnerability, discovered that they had armored themselves against the wrong thing, because the last reading did not need to survive their fire. It had never needed to survive their fire. It had needed only to be entered, and they had entered it. 9,000 times over they had built a column and written it into it, and an entry was a position, and a position at the center was a place from which the whole column could be read. The first conqueror, who had never failed to close a column in 400 years, gave the order to break formation, to scatter, to put distance between the ships, so that some of them could turn and fire on the human hull without striking their own. It was the correct order. It was given too late, but it was correct, and for a moment it seemed it might matter, because the war column was the most disciplined force the Marek had ever fielded, and it began to break apart on command, 9,000 ships peeling outward in every direction at once. But Mara Quill was reading the rolls, and the rolls did not record where a ship was. The rolls recorded that a ship that scattered was still entered. A ship that fled at its highest fold was still a line in the column, and a line in the column could be read, and emptied, and unwritten, from anywhere, because the last reading was not reaching across space to the ships. It was reaching into the ledger, where the ships lived as entries, and from inside the ledger, the distance between the human hull and a fleeing cruiser was the distance between two lines on the same page, which is no distance at all. So the war column scattered, and it did not matter. The entries went blank in order, faster than the ships could flee, faster than the first conqueror could think, and the great obliterating fleet that had been built to deny one ship 6 seconds came apart not in fire but in absence, ship after ship after ship simply ceasing, the rolls going blank line by line, no debris, no flare, no scream, 9,000 ordered entries becoming 9,000 blanks, until the only entry left in the war column was the first conqueror's flagship at the center, beside the 11-kilometer hull that had arrived there by being written, and the small ship near the rear, where Sethran Vol sat with his eyes closed, waiting. Mara Quill stopped the reading 2 entries short. She left the first conqueror's flagship, and she left Sethran's small ship, and she did it for the same reason she had left the unbroken account at Earth, which was that a marker needed a reader, and a reading needed a witness to carry it home. She had read the entire war column except for 2 entries, 11 seconds of unwriting, and now the largest fleet the Merrick Ascendancy had ever built was not destroyed, was not defeated, was not anywhere in the rolls at all, and the column for the war column read blank, as if no war column had ever been assembled, as if the Merrick had never built a single ship to deny the witness in the dark her seconds. The open channel made a sound. The calm voice. It said, "That is the second reading." It said, "You sent 9,000 ships to deny me 6 seconds, and you brought them to me, and I read them in 11. It said, "Your ledger now records that no war column was ever built. Check your rolls. You will find that the largest fleet in your history did not exist, the same way the fleet at Earth did not exist, the same way, soon, the rest of you will not exist, one column at a time, in order, until the reading is done." The first conqueror did not answer. The first conqueror, who had never failed, sat on the command tier of a flagship at the center of a blank column, and discovered the same silence Sethran had discovered at Earth, the silence of a being whose entire civilization had just been proven to be a thing that could be unwritten, and the first conqueror had no words for it. because the Merrick tongue had never needed words for it, because the Merrick had spent 9,000 years on the writing end of the pen and had never once imagined the page could be read back. It was Sethran Vol who answered. He opened the channel from his small ship near the rear, and he spoke to the human voice, and he said the thing he had carried for 130 days, since the dark beyond Halden, since his crew became blanks in the rolls. He said, I was the one you left at Earth. I carried your message home. They called me mad. The rolls said my crew never existed, and so my people decided I had imagined them. He said, you erased 599 ships, and 40,000 of mine, and you made it so I am the only one who remembers they lived. He said, why did you leave me alive to remember that? And Mara Quill answered him, and her voice was not cold and was not warm. It was the voice of someone who had thought about this question for 900 years. She said, because that is what you did to 40 worlds. She said, you did not destroy them, you closed them. You sorted the living, and shipped them out, and left a marker, and on the marker, you wrote the world's name, and a note that said the column was closed, and you put it at the pole where the next surveyor would find it, and the surveyor would read the marker, and know a thing had been here, and was here no longer, and that knowing was the only grave those worlds ever got. She said, I have stood at those markers. I have read those notes. I have spent my life with the names of the dead you would not let be mourned, because mourning requires that a thing be remembered, and your ledger does not remember, it records, and a record is not a memory, it is a number, and a number can be closed. She said, I left you alive because the worlds you closed deserved a marker that could speak. You are it. You are the marker. You carry the names now. You remember the 40,000 because no one else will. And that is not mercy, Sethran Vol. That is the exact thing you did to 40 worlds done back to you once. And you will carry it the rest of your life the way those worlds carry their stone. And when you die, the memory dies with you the way those worlds' memory died with the last of them. And that is the whole of your sentence. And it is the lightest sentence I gave today. Sethran was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the only question he had left. He asked, will you read the rest of us? Will you empty every column? Will you do to the Merrick what the Merrick did to the closed worlds, and leave the galaxy a stone at our pole, with a note that says we are gone? And Mara Quill said no. She said, I could. She said, I have your rolls. I have 11,000 columns, and I have shown you twice that I can read them, and there is nothing in the dark that could stop me from emptying every Merrick entry the way I emptied the fleets, until there was no ascendancy left to record. She said, I have thought about it for 900 years. I read the names of the closed worlds once a year for 900 years, and every year I ask myself whether the answer to 40 closed columns was 11,000 more. She said, the answer is no. She said, the worlds you closed did not ask me to become you. They asked me to remember them, and a thing that empties columns until a whole people is gone is not a witness anymore. It is a second ledger. It is the Merrick, with a different name and a longer grievance. And the species who built me chose, when they built me, that they would end the thing that closes worlds without becoming the thing that closes worlds, because the difference between those two is the only thing that ever made us worth defending. She said, so here is what I am going to do instead. I am going to read your rolls, not to empty them, to open them. I am going to take the 11,000 closed columns of the sovereign ledger, the 40 worlds you stripped, and the 11,000 you took, and I am going to break every seal, and I am going to publish every name, every world, every species, every marker and every note, to every living thing in the galaxy, in every language, so that nothing the Merrick ever closed stays closed, and nothing the Merrick ever did stays a number. She said, your ledger was built so the conquered would be forgotten. I am going to turn it into the largest memorial that has ever existed, and it will have your name on it, the Merrick Ascendancy, the people who closed 11,000 worlds, and it will never close, and it will never be sealed, and it will be read aloud somewhere in the galaxy every single day for as long as there is anyone to read. She said, you wanted to be unremembered. You built a ledger so the dead would be numbers. I am going to make sure the Merrick are the most remembered thing in the history of the galaxy, and that everything you remembered them for is true. And then she said the last thing she would say to him, and it was not a threat, and it was not mercy, and it was the coldest thing Sethran Vol ever heard, because it was simply the truth delivered by someone who had earned the right to deliver it. She said, "Go home, Sethran Volume. Tell your ascendancy that no one is coming to destroy them. Tell them they will keep their worlds and their fleets and their roles. Tell them the witness in the dark is not going to empty a single Merrick column, and then tell them the rest. Tell them that every closed world is being read aloud right now, that the seals are broken and the names are out, that there is not a species in the galaxy that will not soon know exactly what the Merrick did, and exactly how many times, and exactly to whom. Tell them they are not going to be destroyed, they are going to be known, for the rest of time, by everyone." The channel closed. The single white light appeared on the hull of the last reading, far brighter now, bright enough that the first Conqueror's flagship and Sethran's small ship both saw it without instruments. A clean white light in the center of a blank column, and then the 11-kilometer ship folded, not toward Earth, not toward the dark beyond Halden, but outward, into the galaxy, toward the first of the 11,000 closed worlds. And it was gone, and the two surviving Merrick ships hung alone, in the silence, where the largest fleet in their history had been written and unwritten in 11 seconds. What happened next did not happen in a battle, or a council, or a single dramatic hour. It happened the way water happens, everywhere and at once, and impossible to stop. The seals on the closed columns began to break, and as each one broke, the names inside it went out, not on Merrick channels, not through any path the ascendancy controlled, but through the same dark thread the markers had always left, run backward now, carrying the contents of the deep archive outward, to every receiver in the galaxy that could hear. A species 400 years gone, processed and shipped and forgotten, had its name spoken aloud for the first time since its world was closed. And the speaking did not come from a single ship. It came from the rolls themselves, opened, the ledger turned inside out, the great instrument of forgetting made at last to remember in every language it had ever recorded. The first to receive it were the worlds the Merrick had never conquered, the species at the galaxy's quiet edge, who had heard rumors of the ascendancy for 9,000 years, and had always been told, by the Merrick themselves, and by the silence of the worlds the Merrick took, that nothing could be done. They received the names, they received the markers, and the notes, and the balanced columns, the receipts of 11,000 processings, and they read them, and for the first time in 9,000 years, the thing the Marek had been was not a rumor, or a shadow, but a record, complete, undeniable, in the ascendancy's own hand, because the only thing more damning than an accusation is a confession, and the sovereign ledger was the largest confession ever written, and it had been written by the Merrick for 9,000 years, in the belief that no one would ever read it back. Worlds began to read the names aloud, not because anyone asked them to, because the names arrived, and a species that hears the name of a people who were erased finds, in itself, the simple need to say that name where others can hear it, so that the erasing does not finish its work. Assemblies that had never met to discuss the Merrick met now to read the closed columns into their own records. Memorials rose on worlds that had nothing to do with the dead, raised by strangers, because the dead had no one of their own left to raise them, and a galaxy that has finally been handed the truth does not let the truth sit unmarked. Within a year, there was not a populated system in reach of the broadcast that did not know the name of at least one closed world, and within a decade, the reading of the names had become a thing the galaxy did, a quiet, recurring act observed in 1,000 forms across 1,000 cultures, the saying aloud of the columns the Merrick had closed, so that the closing would never be allowed to be complete. The Merrick could not stop it. That was the part the ascendancy understood last and worst. They controlled their fleets and their worlds and their own roles, but the names were out, copied 1 billion times across a galaxy that had every reason to keep them, and there was no fleet that could unsay a name once 1,000 worlds had spoken it, no column that could close what 1,000 cultures had chosen to remember. The Merrick had built their power on the certainty that the conquered are forgotten. The witness in the dark had not taken their power. She had simply removed the certainty, and the power, it turned out, had been nothing but the certainty all along. Sethran Vol flew home for the second time. He did not read the rolls on the journey. There was no point. He knew what they said. They said the war column had never been built. They said the fleet at Earth had never been sent. They said the Merrick had never gone to the human system at all, that the whole of it, the 600 ships and the 9,000 and the 40,000 crew, and the largest force in their history, had simply never happened, and that the quartermaster conqueror Sethran Vol had taken 2 crossings alone and returned with nothing, twice. But the rolls said something else now too. By the time Sethran reached the seat of the ledger, the closed columns had begun to open. The old high scribe of the deepest archive met him at the docks, and she did not call him mad this time, because she had been watching the rolls, and she had seen the seals break one after another, 40 worlds and then 400, and then 4,000, every closed column springing open, every name unsealing, every marker's note appearing in the rolls in a human script the Merrick could no longer pretend not to read. And she had seen the names go out, broadcast across the galaxy on channels the Merrick did not control, to species the Merrick had never conquered, and she had heard, already, in 90 days, the first answers come back, the first worlds reading the names of the closed aloud in their own assemblies, the first memorials raised, the first time in 9,000 years that anyone outside the ascendancy knew exactly what the sovereign ledger had been for. The old high scribe looked at Sethran Vol, and she said, "You carried the message home twice, and we did not believe you, and now the message is in the rolls, and we cannot stop reading it." She said, "The human did not destroy us." She said, "I almost wish she had," and Sethran understood her, because to be destroyed was to be a closed column, a number, a thing the galaxy would forget, the way the Merrick had made the galaxy forget 40 worlds. But to be known, fully, truthfully, forever. Every world they had stripped read aloud daily for the rest of time, with the Merrick name attached. That was a thing the ledger had no column for, because the Merrick had built a civilization entirely on the certainty that the conquered are forgotten, and the conqueror writes the rolls. And a single ship kept apart in the dark by a species they had rated at 0.3, had taken that certainty and turned it inside out, and left them not dead but remembered, which for the Merrick was the one fate worse than the blank. Sethran Vol lived a long time after that. He did the only thing left to a marker that could speak. He carried the names. He had heard 9 of them read aloud at Earth, the 9 Maraquil chose, and he had carried them home, and now that the seals were broken, he learned the rest. All 40 of the worlds the Merrick had stripped, and then he went looking, quietly, in the deepest archive, with the old high scribe's help, for the 11,000 more, the worlds the Merrick had taken and emptied and closed, and he read them, one by one, on the anniversary of the day his fleet became blanks in the rolls, every year, the way a human woman in the dark had read them for 900 years before him. He never saw the last reading again. No one did. It went out into the galaxy with the 11,000 closed columns to read, and it kept reading, and somewhere out in the dark it is reading still, opening a sealed column, publishing a name, raising a memorial out of a marker that was meant to be a grave, and then folding on to the next, in order, without hurry, because the witness who built it decided long ago that the only thing it would ever do quickly was never. The Merrick ascendancy did not fall. That was Maraquil's judgment, and she held to it. They kept their worlds, they kept their rolls, they kept their 9,000 years and their 11,000 columns. They were not emptied, and not destroyed, and not closed. They were simply, from that day, the most remembered people in the history of the galaxy, and everything they were remembered for was true, and there was a ship in the dark making certain it stayed that way, forever, one column at a time. And on Earth, the 240 old ships that had sat cold in their lanes the whole time, the furniture, the survey the humans had wanted the Merrick to see, warmed their drives at last, and went back to their quiet patrols, around a blue world the sovereign ledger now swore had never been found, never been surveyed, never been entered, never been conquered, by a fleet that had never come, that no one would ever remember, because the only ones who could have remembered it were gone from the rolls, unwritten, blank. Which was exactly what the humans had wanted. Earth did not want to be a column the Merrick closed. Earth did not want to be a name read aloud in someone else's memorial. Earth wanted to be the one world in 11,000 that the ledger never got to write at all, and it got its wish, and the price of the wish was a single captain who stayed awake in the dark for 900 years, so that when the lit ships finally came with their banners and their 900 languages, and their flat ceremonial offer to be sorted, there would be one weapon waiting that they could not see, could not enter, and could not close, and one voice ready to read them, at last, the names.